I was standing on the end of a dock I had never been on before, holding a mug of tea that had gone cold in the October air, when the woman who sat one row over from me at work turned to her father and said, "Dad, this is Aaron, my boyfriend." I came very close to stepping off the edge of the dock entirely. The smell of wood smoke and pine resin and something frying in butter inside the cottage had thickened in the way that things thicken when a moment slows itself down on purpose. 12 pairs of eyes settled on me, aunts, uncles, cousins, a grandmother under a wide-brimmed sun hat. Her father reached out his hand, and I, a divorced 36-year-old urban planner with a half-dead professor windowsill, had approximately 4 seconds to make a decision. Tell the truth, or go along with it. I went along with it, and it became the most honest thing that had happened to me in 3 years. Let me go back to the start, the way I should. My name is Aaron Kincaid. 36 years old urban planner at a mid-sized firm called Carver Lund Associates, tucked into a converted Victorian row house near the Glebe neighborhood in Ottawa. My job was making cities make sense, zoning applications, transit corridor studies, heritage overlays, the precise patient kind of work that most people found impenetrable, and I found genuinely calming. I was good at the discipline of it, the logic, the way it rewarded people who were willing to sit still with a problem. My own life, however, had not been especially logical or patient with me in return. My ex-wife Andrea and I signed the separation papers 2 years before this story begins. No children, 5 years of marriage. When it ended, she did not shout or slam anything. She sat across from me at our kitchen table in Centertown and explained, in the measured voice of someone who had rehearsed this, that she needed a partner who would fight for things. Fight for a good table at a restaurant. Fight for his opinion in an argument. Fight for the version of his life he actually wanted. She said being with me was like being with someone who had already made peace with every possible outcome before it arrived. She wasn't entirely wrong. I didn't argue with her. I let her go and moved into a one-bedroom apartment 4 blocks from the canal, bought a used couch, and a good French press, and a spider plant I was only moderately committed to keeping alive. Every morning I walked to the office along the canal path. The geese were always there, the same ones or ones that looked just like them, and after a while I stopped noticing they were there at all. Charlotte Beaumont joined Carver Lund about 10 months before the Thanksgiving weekend. She transferred from the Vancouver office, same firm, different coast, and took the open desk 1 row over from mine in the main floor open plan section. Her background was environmental planning. On her first day, she reorganized her workspace in under 4 minutes, opened a site analysis map on her second monitor, and said nothing to anyone until the 2 p.m. team meeting, at which point she dismantled a 6-week transportation proposal in 3 sentences. Nobody was upset. We were all just quietly impressed that someone had finally said out loud what the rest of us had been circling around for a month and a half. She had a habit I noticed the Tuesday after she arrived. When I came in that morning, there was a small sticky note on the corner of my monitor. It had a tiny drawing on it, a sparrow on a wire, sketched in maybe 15 seconds of ballpoint pen, and underneath it, in small and careful handwriting, a single line from something she was reading. A city is a language spoken slowly, no name, no explanation, just the note. The following Tuesday there was another one, a pine tree this time, a different line, a different source, 41 Tuesdays. I kept every one of them in the back of my top desk drawer, tucked beneath a regional zoning map I never actually needed to reference. 41 times I asked myself the same question and couldn't work up the nerve to ask it out loud. At noon, Charlotte ate lunch alone, on the concrete steps at the side of the building, unwrapping whatever she'd packed from home and reading, with the complete focus of someone who could tune out construction noise, traffic, the full motion of a city in progress. In meetings she sat near the back and said nothing for long stretches, and then said one thing that changed the direction of the whole room. She had a kind of presence that was entirely self-contained. You felt it without her ever asking you to. My ex Andrea called occasionally, always administrative, a piece of mail that had arrived at the old dress. A question about the joint checking account that technically still existed. A follow-up about a shared RRSP contribution we'd made in year 3 of the marriage. Each call was brief and efficient and left me with the feeling of being a file she was slowly but methodically closing. I was not a bad person. I was just a quiet one, and in the particular way that quiet people sometimes can, I had a tendency to leave a room without anyone noticing the temperature had changed. Then on a Thursday afternoon in late September, Charlotte appeared at my desk for the first time without a note. She stood at the edge of my workspace with her jacket already on, the way someone stands when they're prepared to leave quickly, and said, "My family has a cottage on Georgian Bay. We do Thanksgiving up there every year. My dad threw his back out in August and my brother's pulling a shift at the station. He's a paramedic, so they're short-handed for pulling the dock out of the water before freeze-up. Are you free that weekend?" Her voice carried the same tone she used for presenting infrastructure data. Perfectly level. No particular weight attached. I said yes before I thought about it. I did not ask why me specifically. I did not think about the fact that in 10 months she had placed 41 notes on my desk without once explaining any of them. I just said, "Sure, I can do that." And she nodded once and left, and I sat there for a moment looking at the space where she had been standing. The drive up takes about 2.5 hours from Ottawa when the 417 is moving, which it sometimes isn't. I went north through the fall color, the turning maples and birches going gold and burnt orange along the 2-lane roads past Barrie, and followed the GPS down a gravel lane through a stand of white pines, so close, set the sky reduced itself to thin shifting pieces above the windshield. The cottage was a classic Ontario build, white board and batten siding, green trim, a broad screened porch facing the water. The dock was already half disassembled and waiting, and smoke was coming from the chimney in a thin gray line that the wind bent gently sideways. Ken, Charlotte's father, met me at the end of the lane. Thick-shouldered, mid-60s, silver hair, wearing a canvas jacket and rubber boots, the kind of man who has taken the measure of everyone he's met in the first 30 seconds and filed them accordingly. He shook my hand with the grip of someone checking a load rating. He held it long enough to get whatever information he was looking for. His wife Jean came out behind him, wrapped in a fleece vest, and pressed a Tim Hortons travel mug into my hand. Coffee she had clearly brewed herself at the cottage, but had apparently transferred into the Tim's mug on a kind of principle, and said, with a warmth that seemed to have been refined across several decades of practice, "Charlotte has told us so much about you." I nearly said, "That's strange because we've shared an office for 10 months and exchanged approximately 400 words." I didn't say it. I took the coffee and smiled and followed them toward the water. The family folded me in without ceremony. Ken put me to work immediately on the dock. Aluminum frames and cedar decking that had to come out of the shallows before freeze-up. He explained the sequence with the patience of a man who had performed it every October for more years than I'd been alive. And when I got the angle of a section wrong, he corrected me the way a craftsman adjusts another person's grip, rather than taking the tool away. Between lifts he talked, about the property, about how the bay had changed over the decades, about how his own father had driven up from Hamilton every Thanksgiving to open and close this same shoreline. He had a way of folding meaning into practical statements without ever making it sound like a lesson. At one point, setting a cedar plank carefully onto the rack beside the boathouse, he said, "You know what I've learned about old wood? It doesn't just hold weight, it distributes it. The longer it's been doing its job, the better it knows how to share the load." He tapped the plank and went back to work. I understood he was not talking about the dock. Jean's older sister and her husband were up for the long weekend, along with a cousin and her 2 children, who ran between the cottage and the tree line. With the freedom that only exists on Thanksgiving weekend in October, when school is out and the adults are busy, I carried firewood and helped set the long table on the porch, and somewhere between passing the stuffing and listening to a story about Charlotte at age 11 attempting to kayak solo across the bay on a dare, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than relief. The sense of being in a place that was not asking me to be any larger than I actually was. Then late in the afternoon, the sun dropping behind the pines and the lights coming on warm through the cottage windows, Charlotte came through the screen door and crossed the porch toward where I was standing. She moved through her family the way she moved through the office, with total certainty about where she was going and no need to announce it. When she reached me, she tucked her arm through mine. It was quiet and easy, and it felt for exactly 1 second like something that had been done 100 times before. She turned to her father, who had come up from the water and was standing near the porch railing with a bottle of Upper Canada Lager in his hand, and she said, "Dad, this is Aaron, my boyfriend." The dock boards shifted under me, except we were on solid ground. Ken's face went into a smile I hadn't seen before. wide and genuine and a little relieved, the way a man's face goes when something he's been quietly waiting to see finally arrives. Jean made a sound, something between a laugh and an exhale, and crossed the porch and put her arms around me with a firmness that caught me off balance. Over her shoulder I found Charlotte's eyes. She was already looking at me. The whole message was there in the fraction of a second before she looked away. "Don't. Not here, not now, please just stay. I'll explain everything." I gave the smallest nod I could manage, and the evening continued. I played the boyfriend. I sat beside Charlotte at the long table, let her lean into my shoulder when the conversation slowed after dessert, answered the standard questions about what urban planning actually involved, how long the drive from Ottawa was, what my family was like. Charlotte handled the ones she knew better than me. When her aunt asked how long we'd been together, Charlotte said, 10 months, since I transferred to the Ottawa office. 10 months, the exact length of time she had been leaving notes on my desk. Everything she told her family was verifiable. Every single detail was the truth. All she had done was shift one word. Colleague had become boyfriend. Everything else was accurate, just moved a few degrees forward in time towards something that didn't yet exist. Charlotte's brother Jake arrived after dinner, still in his paramedic uniform from an earlier shift, tall and broad, and moving with the deliberate economy of someone who has handled enough genuine emergencies that urgency no longer shows on his face. He scanned me from across the kitchen without extending his hand and said, "So you're the one she won't stop talking about on Sunday calls." The sentence had two edges. One told me Charlotte had been speaking about me to her family for months. The other told me Jake had not yet decided whether that was a compliment to either of us. After the family went inside for the night, Charlotte and I sat on the end of the dock. The lake was very still. The Milky Way was doing what it does north of the city in October. This burned off, and the light pollution is far enough away. Charlotte didn't speak for a while. I counted constellations I half remembered from a high school astronomy unit and didn't bother correcting myself. Then she said, "My mom was diagnosed with early-stage MS 8 months ago." Her voice was level and worn in the way of something said so many times it no longer strikes the person directly, only at angles. "It's manageable. She has a good team at the Ottawa hospital. But things are going to get harder before they get easier, and the one thing she asked me for, the one thing, was to stop carrying everything alone." Charlotte was looking at the water, not at me. I couldn't find anyone I trusted enough to put in this position. Not anyone who would understand what I was actually asking. "Except you." She paused. "I know that sounds like something you say to make a dishonest thing sound reasonable. But it isn't what I mean." I looked at her profile in the dark. She had the posture of something that had used every structural principle it possessed just to remain upright. I drove her back to the cottage. She said goodnight at the door without turning around. I sat in the car for a long time in the dark lane, engine running, white pines invisible above me. When I finally pulled out onto the highway, I could not explain why my chest felt rearranged. I agreed to continue. Every second Sunday I drove up to Barrie or out to the bay. I helped Ken replace the weathered cedar skirting on the cottage exterior, resang warped panels along the foundation, while he told me about a fishing trip he'd taken with his own father on Lake Superior 30 years back. I sat in the living room with Jean on Sunday evenings while she showed me photographs, a young Charlotte attempting to build a birdhouse from pine scraps and a library book, producing something that looked like a very ambitious structural failure. Charlotte and I were clear with each other about what this was, a performance. Two adults maintaining a necessary fiction so that a woman facing a difficult diagnosis could carry one less worry into the hard months ahead. But the line between performing and feeling grew thinner every week. Charlotte's hand found mine when she passed the bread and held it one beat longer than passing bread requires. She laughed differently when it was just the two of us, quieter, less contained, with her eyes going half-closed in a way that suggested the laughter belonged to a room only we could enter. By Wednesday each week I was already measuring the hours until Sunday. The line we'd drawn was still there, but it was drawn in October sand and the frost was coming. Glenn was the one who figured it out. Glenn was a senior transportation planner at Carver Lund, who had been with the firm longer than the current building had and who had the specific sightline of a long-tenure employee, slightly above the normal field of view, missing nothing. One quiet Tuesday in November he set his coffee on the edge of my desk and said, without building up to it, "Beaumont has been leaving those notes since her first week." I said nothing. He stirred his coffee with a pen. I asked her once why she didn't just hand them to you directly. He took a slow drink. She said, because if I hand it to him, he'll feel like he owes me a thank you. And I don't want him to talk to me because he has to. I want him to talk to me because he wants to. I sat with that for a moment without moving. Something structural in my chest had just developed its first hairline crack, the kind that had clearly been forming for a while. The following week, Andrea called. She needed to pick up a hockey bag from the storage locker downstairs. Just needed the combination. She came on a Wednesday evening. While she was heading for the side door, she stopped. On the kitchen shelf beside the kettle, there was a small glass jar with a handwritten paper tag. John had slipped it into my jacket pocket at the end of the previous Sunday visit. A jar of her homemade butter tarts, the tag written in careful block letters, "For when the drive feels long." Andrea picked up the jar and turned it over and read the tag and looked at me. "Who gave you these?" I said. "A friend." Andrea set the jar down carefully and laughed the way people laugh when they think they know something you haven't admitted yet. "A friend," she said, like she was recording it. 2 days later she called again. Her voice had a different temperature. She had found a photo on Instagram. Charlotte's cousin had tagged everyone at a Sunday dinner in Barrie. There I was at the long table in Ken's kitchen, my arm along the back of Charlotte's chair, the kind of photograph that tells its whole story in under a second. Andrea had connected every available dot inside of a minute. "You didn't think I deserved to know you were seeing someone," she said. "We still have a joint RRSP I'm trying to close. I have a right to know these things." The RRSP was the stated reason. What lived underneath it was older and less rational. She had classified me as furniture 2 years ago, and furniture was not supposed to develop a visible life. Andrea started asking questions. She reached mutual friends, people with connections at Carver Lund, and she did it with the efficiency of someone who had always believed information was a form of management. The news moved through our office in about 48 hours. By Friday, a senior partner had asked to speak with Charlotte. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. Charlotte came back to her desk with the color gone from her face and did not look at me for the rest of the afternoon. That evening she sent a text. 8 words. "I'm sorry I dragged you into this." I sat in my apartment with the phone in my hand and the canal somewhere below the window and understood something that hadn't announced itself but had been building without my permission for weeks. I was not angry about the situation. I was angry because someone was hurting her. That was the load-bearing line. That was where everything had shifted for good, and I had just now noticed. I called Andrea. It was the first time in 2 years I had spoken more than 10 consecutive sentences to her. I said, "You left because I wouldn't fight for anything. I found someone who doesn't need constant noise to feel something is real, and you want to take that apart. Don't contact me again." I ended the call. My hands were shaking. I stood in the kitchen with John's jar on the shelf beside me and understood that the man Andrea had called indifferent had just shut a door with both hands and fully intended it. The following Sunday I drove to Barrie. Not because of the arrangement. Not out of obligation or guilt or any word that belongs in a contract. Because I wanted to be there and could not think of a single reasonable argument for being anywhere else. John was in the kitchen when I arrived, moving more slowly than she had in October, her right hand trailing the counter for balance in a way she tried to make look like nothing. But she was standing at the stove. She looked up when I came through the door, and without saying anything she reached behind her and handed me a second jar. Same glass, same handwriting, same careful paper tag. The tag said, "The first jar was in case you didn't come back. This one is because you did." I looked at her. She held my gaze for a moment with the quiet steadiness of someone who sees clearly and has decided not to look away from what she sees. She was not talking about butter tarts. She was talking about whether I was the kind of person who shows up when the situation is uncomfortable and the drive is long. The first jar had been a question. This one was the beginning of an answer. Jake found me in the backyard later that afternoon, stacking firewood along the fence line, while the second period of a hockey game played somewhere inside the house. He came out without a jacket. He folded his arms across his chest and looked at me the way someone looks at a wall they're not yet sure they trust. He said, "I need you to be straight with me. Do you actually care about my sister, or is this something you're doing out of guilt because of what's happening with Mum? Because if it's guilt, I need to know now, not later. Not after she gets hurt." He wasn't hostile. He was a man who had spent enough time in actual emergencies to have a very clean relationship with honesty. I didn't answer immediately, not because the words were missing, but because the answer that surfaced arrived fully formed and surprised me with how certain it was. I said, I don't know exactly what to call it, but on Tuesday mornings, I look at the corner of my monitor before I look at anything else on my desk. If there's a note there, the whole day starts differently than if there isn't. Jake was quiet for a moment. His expression didn't soften exactly. It recalibrated, the way someone's does when they realize the ground they're standing on is more solid than they'd expected. He uncrossed his arms and extended his hand. I took it. It was not a test this time. It was something that meant more than a test. That evening, Charlotte and I sat on the back step in the dark. The yard light was on, and the first hard frost of the season had made the grass brittle and pale. Inside, Ken was doing the dishes and the radio was on low. Charlotte looked out at the yard for a long time before she turned to face me. She said, I owe you the full truth. My mom's diagnosis, that's real. That was never a lie. But I didn't choose you only because you were the person I trusted. She stopped. She selected her next words with the same precision she brought to every planning document, every heritage assessment, every paragraph where imprecise language actually cost people something real. I chose you because you were the only person I could introduce as my boyfriend without it feeling like a performance. It wasn't a lie. It was just ahead of schedule. She breathed out slowly, the long breath of someone who has been holding something for months and has finally allowed themselves to set it down. Every Tuesday when I left that note, I told myself that proximity was enough. That sitting one row over was enough. That just being near you was enough. But it was never enough. And when Mom got sick, it gave me a reason to do what I had wanted to do since I transferred to Ottawa. Stand beside you and say your name that way. I let that sit. The frost was settling further into the grass. Somewhere up the street a dog barked once at something and then stopped. I kept all 41, I said, in the back of my top drawer under a zoning map I haven't needed since 2023. She looked at me. I looked at her. The yard was very dark and very still beyond the reach of the light. Stop calling it ahead of schedule, I said. Let me catch up. We didn't make an announcement at the office. We didn't post anything. What changed was simply that on Tuesday mornings, when the note appeared on the corner of my monitor, I said thank you for the first time. She looked up from her screen and gave me the small private smile of someone who has waited a reasonable amount of time for a reasonable thing, and finally received it. Renata, Jean, held steady through the winter. A new medication protocol from her neurologist at the Ottawa hospital, adjustments to the daily routine, physiotherapy twice a week. She had hard weeks and easier ones, and approached all of them with the characteristic approach of her household. You do what needs doing, you don't make an occasion of the difficulty. On the days when Ken had prior commitments, I drove her to appointments. The drives were mostly quiet, and that quiet was the earned kind. One afternoon in March, on the way back from a scan along the 417, she reached across the console and took my hand. Her grip was lighter than it had been in October, but deliberate. She said, without looking away from the road ahead, I knew from the very first weekend that you weren't Charlotte's boyfriend. I made some sound because she smiled. A mother knows. The way you watched her at dinner that Saturday night, it wasn't the way a man looks at someone he already has. It was the way a man looks at someone he's still working up the nerve to reach for. She squeezed my hand gently. But I also knew you'd get there. Some things just need a little patience and one good push in the right direction. I didn't say anything. I kept my eyes on the highway and my hands steady on the wheel, because if I had turned to look at her in that moment, the road ahead would have blurred past any useful point. In the spring, I moved to Toronto for a new project, and Charlotte transferred to the firm's Toronto office not long after. She came over and found her way around my kitchen with the ease of someone who had already mentally mapped a space before entering it. She brought a small pot of basil from the St. Lawrence Market one Saturday and set it on the windowsill beside the spider plant, which had, against all reasonable odds, pulled through the winter. The two plants sat in the morning light, and neither of them seemed to require any explanation. We didn't rush. We had already been introduced to the world as a couple. Now we simply needed to make it true. Making it true turned out to be the easiest thing I had done in years. Easier than pretending, easier than performing, easier than all those Sunday dinners in Barrie when I'd needed to remind myself I was acting. Because it turned out I hadn't been acting at all. I had just been early. That October we went back up to Georgian Bay for Thanksgiving. Same cottage, same white pines and green trim and screened porch, and the dock freshly reassembled and sitting low on the still gray water, same butter tarts cooling on the rack in the kitchen. But everything underneath had shifted, and no one standing in that kitchen needed anyone to say so. When Charlotte walked in and tucked her arm through mine and turned to her father, she said, "Dad, this is Aaron." She didn't add a single word. She didn't need to. Ken broke into the widest, most unguarded grin I had seen on his face in over a year. Jean covered her mouth with both hands and cried the quiet way people cry when something they've been praying for privately actually arrives. Jake stepped forward and hit my shoulder once with the heel of his fist, the way men do when words would be less accurate than the gesture. I was holding my coffee mug with both hands, steady, not anywhere close to dropping it. Jean came across the kitchen and placed a small glass jar in my hands. Third one. Same handwriting, same careful paper tag. But the tag said something different. It said, Beaumont Kincaid family recipe. My name was on it. Not as a guest, not as a trial, as part of the recipe itself. I used to believe that being quiet in a room meant you were losing the room. Andrea had been clear about that. The world tended to agree. Every piece of advice anyone had ever given me about relationships seemed to assume that presence was something you announced with volume. But Charlotte heard me inside the quiet. She didn't need me to be louder, or more forceful, or more like the kind of person who fills a room without being asked. She just needed me to be there, and I was. Every Tuesday morning, every Sunday dinner, every long drive back to the city in the dark with the salt trucks going by and the radio on low. I was there. Sometimes people find love in loud places. Apps where you swipe through faces until your thumb stops registering the choice. Bars on a Friday night where you have to lean in close just to be heard, and something about the leaning gets mistaken for wanting. I found mine in a sticky note left on the corner of my monitor every Tuesday morning with no name attached, and a jar of butter tarts with a handwritten tag that said, "For when the drive feels long." She introduced me as her boyfriend before I had become one. But maybe she wasn't early. Maybe I was just late. If someone introduced you as their partner in front of their entire family, without any warning, would you go along with it? Or would you set the record straight right there on the spot? Do you think Charlotte was right to do what she did? Leave your answer in the comments below. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button and subscribe to his private stories. There's always another one worth telling.